Access to the staircase down to the first floor was through an opening on the interior wall of the hallway, in the direction Amina had originally been heading before the disaster struck. It was sheltered from the direction the shockwaves seemed to have come from, but Amina still felt uneasy as she descended the debris-covered steps. Her feet slipped on glass and dirt that had blown through the passage and down onto the stairs, and she worried she might fall if she let go of the railing for even a second. She was also concerned that the stairs would simply give way beneath her. The whole building had been shaking. Pieces of the ceiling had fallen in and walls and floors had collapsed. She didn't feel like her fears were unjustified. One careful step after another, Amina slowly descended to the ground level. Here, too, Amina could see signs of massive destruction. Passing by classrooms, she could see more of what she had seen in Miss Macris's room. Mutilated bodies and wounded students struggling to get to their feet or help friends and classmates they couldn't possibly save. She was fairly sure she saw the hole that led back up into the civics room, a pile of limbs and rubble beneath it. At the entrance to the building, pieces of wall around the front doors had collapsed, leaving the doors themselves blocked but gaps leading to the outside open. Amina found herself in a flock of other less wounded students filtering out to the front of the school, although less wounded was relative. Almost everyone present was bleeding or burned in some way. Students cradled broken arms or supported each other on ruined legs. As a singular mass covered in dust and gore, they staggered forward and clambered through the holes in the front of the building to freedom like a zombie horde. For a few terrifying moments, Amina found herself trapped in a crush of bodies, people packed suffocatingly close as they pushed and struggled in their efforts to get free of the structure. Then, finally, she was through and able to breathe again. It was winter. Cold air should have hit Amina as she stepped out of the school. Instead, she was struck by a thick heat that seemed to be carried on the air itself, rather than coming from any specific direction. Ahead, past the other survivors shuffling across the ground, Amina could see that the library and houses across the street had fared worse than the school. The library was ablaze, its roof falling in and its floor-to-ceiling windows gone. The houses were similarly ruined. A thick haze of smoke hung over the area, and trees and lawns had caught on fire, threatening to turn the ruined locale into a blaze. With more students trickling out of the building behind her, the movement of the small crowd of wounded prompted Amina to shamble down the front steps to make room for those exiting behind her lest she be shoved down them instead in someone's rush to escape. Less a conscious effort on her part and more an instinctual response to the movements of the herd. To Amina's right, a handful of other students were heading to the front of the school grounds. Some were leaving the gymnasium while others were coming from the athletics field beyond it. Like those in Amina's group, they moved at a glacial pace, sporting grievous burns and other wounds. Some of them called for help. Some of the more able-bodied survivors were heading in that direction to lend whatever assistance they could. Amina made her way towards the physical education students as well, less because of a futile desire to help and more because one of the voices she heard crying out was familiar. Amid the cacophony of shouts and groans, Amina recognized the voice of Kendra, her friend. In the midst of the insanity, there was a small comfort in familiarity. It was a comfort that was short-lived. Kendra stumbled forward blindly, waving her arms in front of her. Most of her short blonde hair had been burned away, exposing the seared scalp beneath. The remaining clumps were charred and darkened. What was left of her gym clothes that hadn't been incinerated had fused to her skin. She had sported something of a healthy tan, being the athletic sort that spent a lot of time outdoors. Now her skin was a patchwork of nightmares. She was blistered and bright red in some places. In others she was charred black or sported a sickly pallor in the texture of leather, blood leaking through cracks where her body had been dried out. "I can't see!" Kendra screamed between rapid breaths. Before, she had walked quickly as though always wanting to break into a run. Now she moved like a woman 5 times her age, every movement causing her pain. "It hurts! Help!" Driven forward by the urgency of Kendra's cries, Amina moved quicker, not quite breaking into a jog, but moving fast enough that it caused her head to spin and the sharp pain from her wound to increase. She slowed back to a more measured walk once she was within a few feet of the other girl. "Kendra? What happened?" Amina hadn't realized how dry her throat was until she spoke. It was like she had swallowed some of the glass that littered the ground. Kendra turned towards Amina, still waving her arms out in front of her wildly. Her own voice was ragged and raspy in a way it had never been before. "I don't know. Help me." Amina grimaced. She didn't like seeing her friend in such agony, but how was she supposed to help when she didn't even know what had happened? She had thought it was an earthquake, but would that have left things so suddenly on fire and people burned and barbecued? Amina didn't know. Em? Kendra was hyperventilating, her breaths short, fast, and shallow, and only getting more so the longer it took Amina to give her the help she needed. She wasn't shouting anymore, her words now whimpers instead. With how her throat sounded, Amina wasn't even sure she could shout anymore. What can I do? Amina asked. A not small part of her wanted to simply turn and run. Seeing her classmates and teacher injured or dead was distressing enough. Seeing someone she actually cared about looking like a walking corpse or something out of a horror movie? It was too much. Yet, she couldn't be the one who abandoned her friend in a disaster. What would become of herself if she did that? I don't know, Kendra said. Everything hurts. I can feel my skin tearing when I move. I feel sick. It's like I'm falling apart. They'd learned about burns at one point, Amina remembered. You were supposed to run cold water over them. That had always worked for her when she had minor burns. She couldn't remember how long you were meant to do it or if the treatment changed for more severe injuries. However, she figured it was better than nothing. Okay, don't talk anymore. I'm going to help you. Amina couldn't bear to listen to Kendra's destroyed voice any longer, and surely trying to talk wasn't helping her any. Let's see if we can do something about those burns. Gingerly, she took Kendra by her less scorched hand. She could still feel the heat off the skin and the blood dripping from cracks. She could still hear Kendra whimpering at the contact. It was the best she could do. She started leading her friend back towards the gym. She heard a person screaming before she was even particularly close to the building. By the time she was opening the shattered remnants of the door, the sound was deafening. Her head was already hurting. The howling felt like someone was driving an axe into her skull. Amina persevered, leading Kendra down the hallway and through a door into the change room. Two of the shower stalls were occupied, the sound of running water mixing with the cries of one of the occupants and the quieter groans of the other. Is this going to hurt? Kendra said, barely even whispering the question. I think it should feel better, Amina replied. That was the best she could offer.
Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, or mechanics is out, unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I am Daniel Radford, author, repeat offender, and also your host. And today I'm joined once more by my usual co-host, voice actor, narrator, streamer, John Kernan.
Hello, I don't have any patience for kids in a crisis.
I'm sure you're not the only one. John was, of course, also the owner of the voice you just heard reading a sample from my newest novel, Marble. Marble being the focus of tonight's episode, which is the final in our cycle on sequels, as well as the finale for season 3. Which is insane to say out loud that we've made it to the end of season 3.
Right? It's been going for a while now.
It doesn't feel like it's been that long,
No, no, it doesn't.
and yet here we are.
Yeah, just
Slowly.
have to remember that that this has been going on longer now than my relationship to my lovely fiance.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. We always knew that I was really number one in your heart.
Well, hmm.
Me and
Hmm.
my swarm of crickets who have also been with us since season.
The wonderful, lovely swarm of crickets.
One day I'll get real soundproofing, maybe for season 4.
What about cricket proofing?
I don't know if that exists.
Unfortunately, I think it doesn't. I think crickets might be just about the hardest bug to keep out of things. I think it's easier to keep yeah, no, it is. It's easier to keep ants out of things.
I mean, much success there either. So, anyway, before we get onto a tangent about various insects, I suppose I can get into this with a little bit of background on Marble. You know, my sort of thoughts going into it, why I wrote it the way I did, some stuff like that. And honestly, I don't have many notes for this one. Weirdly enough, being the guy who wrote the book, I'm kind of just winging it. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, nobody spent more time thinking about the book than you. I'd say you're qualified enough.
Yeah, honestly, it was like that was part of it. I was like, I have spent years thinking about this book. I'll manage. Watch me now fumble the episode.
I have some vague, faint idea of how I feel about the book I wrote with my own brain. It's five
Yeah,
minutes later. So you see, if you look here at this part, it's I worked really hard on it, and I think it's pretty good.
yeah. So obviously, Marvel is a sequel to Domino. In case you haven't read that or heard me talk about it before, both of them deal with this city Kuden in the fictional country of Ionia, which gets blown up by a nuclear bomb by this group called the Liberation Movement, who you may note don't really feature that prominently in either book, which is something we can possibly get into as well later on. But
I I mean, as long as you're covering Kuden or anywhere else they bombed, it'd be kind of hard to see them, right? It's not like they would be. It's not like they would be going in and assisting with the rescue efforts or would have had many of their agents around at the place they knew they were going to nuke.
yeah, you'd think. But yeah, it primarily each book deals with a different set of people, young people primarily, as they are sort of dealing with the aftermath of the bombing, trying to survive the both literal and figurative fallout of the situation, the various environmental hazards, as well as deal with their own trauma and problematic social dynamics and things like that.
Yeah, the exact thing I was hoping The Walking Dead was going to do before it went on for 11 seasons and then had sequel show spin-offs instead of just splitting earlier. It did split. There's Fear the Walking Dead and one or two other little things, but it's one of the best examples I could ever think of a story I wish had been not short and sweet, but gone on a decent amount of time and then just split and started covering other people because I really like getting that vibe when you do look at some of the spin-off stuff. Like, it's part of the reason why I like the game. You know, when you have a good setting, especially a setting where lots of people are prone to die or it's mainly about struggle above all else, it's satisfying to keep seeing how other people are handling that struggle without it constantly being through the lens of, well, here's the group I care about and here's this new group over here.
Yeah, because that's the thing. That was basically my first and foremost thought going into this, right? Was this entire city has been hit by a nuke. More than two people are going to be affected by this. And in some ways that other people might be affected the same ways, but in other ways they're definitely going to be affected differently. And obviously, Amina, Arben, and Saba are very different people to Hector and Ellie with very different concerns and backgrounds and problems.
Yeah, and it's a little less symbiotic thanks to the age gaps.
Very different dynamics between them as well, yeah. Yeah, I mean that was the number one thought was, okay, I have an entire city here. Other people are going to be affected by this major event. Who else has been affected with it? And then from there, it was a matter of trying to decide, how I wanted to differentiate the struggles of this new group of characters from the old group. So in book one, of course, we have Hector and Ellie. Hector, who is he's got some troubles at home. He's not like a crazy abusive household or anything like that, but he has a very successful older brother who is doing very well for himself in the military, who did very well for himself during his education, who is kind of the apple of his parents' eyes, and Hector had never been able to live up to that sort of reputation and those expectations. Not the ones his parents had for him as a result of his brother's success, and not the ones he had for himself. And he was sort of going through a bit of a delinquent phase. Not really delinquent, I guess, but he was he sort of went, well, I'm never going to be good enough anyway. Like, what's the point of putting all this effort in? I'm just going to use Skype off school, hang out with these sort of this rougher group of friends who are, they're not great, but they've also got all these problems of their own.
Yeah, Hector's parents are the kind of people that would push their kid from like 5 years old to be a sports star and just constantly say and do things that are meant to be caring, meant to be concerned, but really come off as, oh, why isn't it easier to mold you into the perfect little thing I want you to be?
Yeah, exactly. So at the start of that book, Hector is, he's run off to skip school. He's hanging out with some other people at his like underground parking lot. They go off to get booze, and then the bomb goes off. They get erased basically, and he's wakes up a little while later, safe-ish because he was underground.
The kids, that's just another reason not to drink before you're 21. You never know when you might get nuked.
So obviously, he's not a bad person. He's quite compassionate and caring as an individual. As it turns out, he's quite easy to get along with. And even though he's not necessarily incredibly academically gifted, he's not stupid. He's very good at putting like things he's learned, like remembering things he's learned and putting those practical skills to use later on, which it proves very helpful to him in his situation.
And he's not at all selfish,
Yeah.
despite how it can look if you look at his disagreements with his parents from the wrong angle.
So much of the story is him, one, coming to terms with how he feels about his parents, both his guilt at the last interaction they had before they died, and then also coming to the realization that he is a person who can help and can do things. And by comparison, of course, he's paired with Ellie, who is also dealing with guilt, but of a very different variety because her parents were the ones who did the suicide bombing, and she ran away at first, and by the time she came back, they had already left to do the mission, and she holds herself responsible for not stopping them.
Yeah, you actually set up a perfect contrast. Sorry to interrupt, but a perfect contrast between our two point of view characters in the books because the biggest branching clear difference between the two of them from moment one is as soon as Hector realizes the situation is a lot worse than he thought, but he's not nearly as banged up as you might expect from somebody who survived a nuclear blast. His first thought is, where can I go? I should be on the lookout for people who need my help. And Amina's first thought was, I need to go look for someone who can help me.
Exactly, and that is pretty much a really good jumping point to bring us to Marble, our sequel here, because obviously Amina had to be a very different person to Hector to justify the story's existence. And I looked at who Hector was, and I thought, well, Amina needs to be his opposite in a lot of ways. She's a little bit older. She's in her final year of schooling, on her verge of doing her mandatory service, and she is a little bit more informed about the like workings of the world, but she's also selfish and self-centered and a bit childish. She's anti-liberation movement, but only in the extent that it is likely to negatively affect her what the government is doing. If the government was imposing their censorship and surveillance laws on everywhere else and she was left out of it, she'd probably be like, all right.
Yeah, her disapproval of the liberation movement is the same thing as wanting the kid who's next to you in class to shut up, not because you're paying attention to the teacher, because you don't want to listen to him get in an argument with the teacher.
Yeah. And she also enters the story with an argument. But whereas Hector is feeling the pressure and can't handle it, she is feeling irritated because this perfectly nice teacher exists and takes spotlight away from her and has expectations that she is going to behave more adult and things like that, as opposed to, the unfair expectations that put upon Hector.
Yeah, she's aware that her parents have spoiled her. And even though that tempers her a little bit, it doesn't temper her enough not to still have all those spoiled feelings and not want anyone to tell her what to do or put any sorts of limits on her. To her, any limits at all might as well be shackles because her parents never gave her any.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Very, very well said. And yeah, when the shit hits the fan, at first she is just completely overwhelmed. But you're exactly right. Her first thought was not, how can I help people? It was, this is insane. I need help. Somebody help me. And she has that mentality for a while.
Yeah. And although that immediately frames Hector as more selfless and her as more selfish, which is true, it doesn't make her selfish to the extreme or a bad person. It's one of the things I like seeing it from the perspective of someone who's feeling that way because I I am often a proponent that people are far too quick to idolize selflessness and far too quick to disdain any level of selfishness at all.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's about balance, generally speaking. Like too much selfishness is definitely not healthy, but too much selflessness is also not good for you.
Yeah, you can have toxic. I mean, we've talked before about how you can have toxic selflessness, and to a point, you can even have positive selfishness, and everybody needs a certain amount of it. And so far, I think Amina is showing a mostly healthy, if slightly too much and slightly childish amount of it. But considering everything she's going through, she's doing pretty good. She's doing better than a lot of people would still.
Yeah, I think it is understandable that she feels the way she feels. I do think that she's a little too focused on herself throughout a lot of the early parts of the book, but
Oh
that's
yeah.
by design, obviously.
She is a teenager and she was just in a horrible, awful disaster.
Yeah. So she does basically spend like the first couple chapters looking for ways to help herself. The first several chapters, even, it goes on for a little while. Even when she first encounters Saba and Arben, while she does take them under her wing and take care of them, she still is primarily at first just looking for ways to palm them off onto someone she feels is more qualified, or at least that's her justification. The reality is that she just doesn't want to deal with them when she's dealing with all this shit herself, which is understandable because she is not at all prepared mentally in any way to be a caregiver at all, let alone a caregiver to these two children she does not know in the middle of a disaster.
But you have to give her credit for the fact that she's not any more prepared to get rid of them and dump them to whatever their fate is than she is to deal with them.
Yeah, I think if she just left them without doing anything to help them, without taking them, then she would have been irredeemable. But you can tell that she's not really a bad person. She just has growing to do. And I think, yeah, that puts her in contrast to Hector, who is a lot more practical and a lot more selfless and conscious of others' needs and empathetic. She has very little in the way of practical skills because she's been spoiled so much, and she has a very self-centered view of the world.
Yeah, the extent of her practical skills and all that might as well just be exactly what she was forced to learn in high school and how much of that she actually retained against her will.
Like she obviously remembers some stuff. You see that she's not stupid and she does have some memory of things she learned in school. She's not been completely never paying attention or anything. But she's definitely lacking in Hector's ability to like apply skills that he remembers practically, and she's definitely lacking just in practical knowledge in general.
Yeah, that's another good contrast between them. Amina's always lived a life of putting in the bare minimum and having approval and things given to her anyways. And Hector has had a life of giving it his best and still constantly being made to feel short and not good enough.
Exactly. And Emina's journey through this, I think, is interesting to watch, right? Because obviously it's the trajectory is not hard to figure out for the most part. Obviously, she is going to grow to become a less selfish person. She's going to grow to care more about the people around her and their suffering and their traumas and their problems. She's going to learn ways to be practical and in the moment and helpful. All of the things that are flaws in her that are not in Hector are things that she is going to improve on, and that is a big part of her journey, just becoming a kinder, more empathetic person. But something that is not immediately obvious is that that is not the only part of her character development. For one thing, she's gonna like she does later on start swinging arguably a little too far in that direction in later chapters of the book, sort of trying to make up for all the earlier things she did and who she used to be a little bit, and starts having to struggle to find balance to get into that sort of like healthy zone again. But on top of that, something that I think is really interesting about her character is that there's this weird contrast baked into her, right? Where she starts the story as very self-centered and selfish and, childish, not a bad person, but hardly the best person, and very not extreme in her political views or anything like that, right? But as she becomes a more empathetic, kinder person, she also becomes angrier about the situation and about the LM and becomes more extreme in her views on the political side of things as a result.
Yeah, she's being galvanized by what she's having to go through.
Yes, exactly. And that's the other thing that puts her in contrast to Hector, right? Who starts off apolitical. He has like very little knowledge or understanding of any of that stuff. And as he goes through this hell and sees and gets to interact with Saba, of course, not Saba, there, Ellie, who plays a big part in that in his development, he comes to understand the other side and why they feel the way they feel and become more liberal leaning and more open-minded about why the liberation movement feels the way they do and ended up so extreme and broken themselves.
Yeah, I like that they both started out mostly apolitical, but they're just shifting in different directions.
You can't go through something like Kuden and come out the other end apolitical.
No, I think people rarely can feel apolitical after going through any sort of disaster, like social disaster, especially anything caused explicitly by politics.
Their differences in their personalities and the slight differences in the differences in who they interact with throughout the story and the like slight differences in their circumstances and just all of that end up pushing them in different directions where Hector becomes very mellow almost and understanding that the other side are not all these extremists compared to Amina, who becomes progressively more angry about the LM and what they did and people of their ilk and what they may do, to the point where she's like, at some point, she actually openly muses, well, not openly, but muses to herself. Maybe all the surveillance and stuff is not a bad idea if it's going to stop this from happening to people, which is a big jump from where she was at the beginning, where she's like, I don't want the government watching me.
Yeah. She never wanted to be watched, but she also was never explicitly morally against the idea of watching. So there's nothing stopping her from leaning into it more as she sees the practical side of it.
Yeah, exactly. And that is one of the other things about Marble in that it contrasts Domino in that sense as well, where obviously my views are present in both books, but I'm not trying to give an answer to Kuden or rather Ionia's political situation, where obviously they're quite authoritarian, they're quite surveillance heavy, all these things, because that is mostly in the background of both of these books. It is just the reason why things happen. Neither book is really about the politics on the surface level. They are both about the people who are affected by the attack and essentially the suffering they go through and why people in positions to do these things shouldn't afflict that on people. But both books present in some ways contrasting answers and ideologies to each other.
Yeah, I like seeing that. It's a natural way for people to go through political upheavals and stuff like that, especially because, they're sometimes it can be easy to make your choice or not, but even when you do, there's always like I don't want to get too far into the political side of things, but I will say that in my opinion, at least in any political conflict, at least, especially like I should say a political conflict of arms, at the very least, any sort of rebellion or war, even when it's easy to pick which side you think is better or worse, there's always the duality, if nothing else, at the very least, of even if the side you think is right, they are still choosing to fight. They are still choosing to hurt people and choosing to accept what the consequences of their actions will be. And it's kind of why, even though I'm not a career both sides are like a certain someone we both know, I do always like having at least a little bit of that angle around in stories like this because ultimately, no matter how justified you may not be in your decision, you don't get to say you're not accepting the consequences of your actions when you choose to do something. And the actions of war and things like bombings is always a ton of death and pain and hurt.
And frequently inflicted upon those who aren't actually responsible for what you're fighting against.
Yeah, you can never have, I'm of the opinion that you can never have more than a little bit of damage and death and pain and suffering before it is inevitably going to be spiraling to at least one person who doesn't deserve it, if not many.
Yeah, exactly. And both books do make a point of sort of highlighting this. It's a big focus of the books is this idea that this is when people in positions of power, whether that's because of political authority or because they have access to bombs or whatever, take up violent arms against each other. It is the people who are caught in the middle who suffer. That is the core premise of the entire series. The sort of differences between the two, I think, is that the main point of Domino is is to sort of go, okay, the LM's politics are arguably better than Ionia's, but their methodology clearly is not. The methods they are employing to get to that end goal, look at what they did, clear like, is it worth it? Is the question at the end of Domino. Because we know that the LM effectively get what they wanted in the end.
Yeah, it's it's all too easy to say that they were right to fight, but you have to ask your question, is this the way they should have fought? Was this the right way to fight? And as you already said, was it worth it?
Yeah, Marble, on the other hand, is less about is it worth it because we've already put that question out there. I mean, it's always floating about, but it's more an exploration of how extreme circumstances inflicted upon people can take someone like Amina and make them more extreme over time.
Yeah, like sometimes it is a more inherent thing, but it's easy to forget sometimes that most extremism we see comes from a real place, even if it's spiraled out of control and became something terrible. It almost always started from somewhere normal and from a couple sensible decisions maybe being made in response to something bad and unfair, then continuing to branch and get worse and worse and worse. It's kind of the same thing as trying to see the human behind villains, but I also think it's more complex than that because despite its similarities, it applies to just about everybody. And it's scary to think sometimes how easy it can be for somebody who is normal and sensible and has no intentions of ever doing anything bad to continue making those normal, sensible decisions all the way to suddenly not making good and sensible decisions anymore and still thinking they're just as normal as they ever were. People say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but I almost say you could take a more neutral thing than that and also say like the road to destruction or turning down a dark path can just easily be paved with perfectly normal, sensible reactions to everything that's going on around you.
Yeah, extreme circumstances breed extreme reactions.
That's for sure.
Of course, Amina obviously is our focused character. She is our POV character. There is no chapters from someone else's perspective in Marvel. So you follow her like view of things through the entire story. But that doesn't mean she's our only character, of course. Actually, Marvel has notably, partially I guess because it's twice as long, but notably it has more characters present in the story than Domino did. Because Domino, I really would wanted to focus on cultivating that empty feeling of just how many people were dead by just not putting that many people into the story.
Yeah, just how extraordinary it is that that the two of them are even doing as good as they are.
Yeah, because they hardly encounter anyone through the first day of their journey.
And most of the people they do encounter are already so hopeless or so close to death that even thinking about them is only inviting yourself to fall into a pit of despair, and all you can do is keep walking.
Yeah. Amina, by contrast, starts her story surrounded by people as well, because she starts at school. She then quickly comes across another survivor in the streets. She then eventually meets Arben and Saba. She later on runs into someone else again. She meets some other survivors at other points in the story. And I think some of that is because I realized I don't need to make it feel quite as empty this time because I've already sort of pushed that in the first book, and part of that is just because Marvel's longer. She's gonna run into more people.
Yeah. I really like that right away she meets one of her friends only for him to immediately out himself as the younger, incomplete version of a Resident Evil villain.
I mean, Alexander was never her friend.
Okay, right, fair. Acquaintance, a person she was aware of who she thought was smart enough to help, but still, just literally just immediately throwing out lines a Resident Evil antagonist says, being like, no, there's no point in any of this. Fuck it, I'm out of here.
Yeah, well, I mean, extreme circumstances, extreme reactions. He is someone who Emina has not necessarily directly bullied, but she's part of the in crowd. He's not, and she has been a part of the groups that have not been kind to him. So when she comes to him expecting him to help her, he's like, nah, fuck this. I am struggling myself right now. I owe you nothing. And I think it's obvious at that point that he has realized what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
After all, she even knows he's kind of a nerd about the military and things like that.
When he was immediately throwing out like symptoms of and things that come with radiation and nukes, almost as if frustrated that she hadn't already pieced it together.
Yeah, he's not doing great with it. The realization immediately has not helped him.
No, I do like it as a bit of contrast, though, that despite the fact that he has his reasons to treat her as he is, and that she is asking him for help, I think it's also still a good sign that even though Amina is selfish, she could be a lot more selfish because here's someone doing it right in front of us. Because despite the fact that his reasons, he may have reasons, there's still the fact that what are his odds of finding anyone else who's still in as physically good condition as her? And how is he not even thinking for a second that although she may be asking for help, she could also help him a lot more than he's likely to run into on the road? And that they might be better off together because all he can think is, "You're not my friend. I don't know you anything. This sucks. We're all fucked anyways. Why should I help you? I'm leaving."
Alexander is an interesting character to me because I think his reaction to it all is also very understandable.
Yeah.
He's just immediately crushed by it, and I don't know if yeah, I'm gonna keep that bit to myself actually. But as far as other characters go, obviously the other most prominent ones are Sava and Arben.
Saba's a sharp kid.
Yeah, Arben, I honestly I don't have as much to say about Arben. He's already
He's
very young, and
he's
he
six.
has he's 6, and he's kind of regressed a little bit anyway because of the trauma response.
Yeah. There's never really that you can only have so much development for anybody below a certain age in a disaster scenario.
Yeah, so Arben's not unimportant. He is a prominent part of the story, but he doesn't really have a journey as a character,
Yeah.
and that's fine. I think he's not supposed to. He is, however, very important to the plot because getting him to his parents is like the primary goal of Amina and Saba for a lot of the story, and he's very important to Saba, who is a much more fleshed out character. And it's interesting because in some ways she at times reminds me a lot of Ellie, because I mean they're both girls about the same age for starters, and they are both have a sort of sense of almost maturity beyond their years, but they're coming from two very different places. They even both struggle with guilt a bit, but Ellie's sort of sense of maturity is because she has had this extreme political ideology pushed at her from a very young age,
Yeah.
and and not literally, but basically had the LM politics beaten into her since she was able to understand words.
And her only two options were to completely give into it and just become a mouthpiece for it, or stand strong and become her own person. Because even though her parents seemed like they cared enough that they probably weren't trying to mold her directly into anything, that's just kind of a side effect of being related to anybody who's an extremist, is like whether you're giving into it or not, you are developing around it. And I don't mean developing around it as in developing near it. I mean literally around it, like it's an object you're shaping around.
Yeah, exactly that. And that is the thing, is like that's where that sense of maturity, a lot of that comes from with Ellie, is it's not real. It's manufactured. And I think at times the reality of that does show through, when she's having her emotional moments or taking very extreme actions.
And also alternatively when she's stepping back and really enjoying just having Hector take charge and handle things, almost not wanting him in moments here or there to be quite as gentle as he is, because she's enjoying may be the wrong word, but it's feeling good and right to her to finally let go of the maturity for a moment and just be letting someone else take the reins when she doesn't know what to do and she doesn't feel good. But at the same time, she's bad at doing that and keeps second guessing herself and feeling like she's not doing enough.
Yeah, which is, now that I think about it, something she kind of has in common with Hector. But Saba, on the other hand, has a more naturally grown maturity almost, because she's the oldest child of three.
Yeah, I was gonna say she immediately gives the strong vibe of has already been taking care of people from a young age.
Exactly. And she has been doing a lot of taking care of her younger siblings and filling the older sibling role. And in a lot of ways, that does breed that sort of take care of other people mentality. So she naturally gravitates towards caring for Arbin, who is younger than her. And a lot of what Amina reads as being, I'm trying to think of the right words here.
Difficult?
Difficult, that'll do, difficult or standoffish or just acting against Amina's perceived authority as the oldest.
Slightly bossy despite asking for help.
Yeah, is that Saba is not even thinking on those terms.
For her, it's almost pure practicality. She wants the help, but she is also literally only thinking of what's best for Arbin and what they'll do continuing to move forward.
Yeah, she is purely focused on filling this older sibling role almost for Arbin and taking care of Arbin and making sure that he is healthy and looked after. The
Yeah.
way Amina feels about that has not even it's never even really occurred to her. It's just where Amina fails, she steps up to the plate because that is what she is, I guess, programmed to do.
Yeah, they inherently can't fully understand each other in this moment because they're being so inherently different. Like, Saba is currently 100% on the selfless train, to the point where even though she's being selfless, she's not being considerate of everyone's feelings, because her big sister mode means 100% of the focus is on who's the youngest, who's in the most in help and in need of care. And all the rest of us should be worried about that and nothing else. So, despite the fact that she probably doesn't really have anything against Amina and wants the best for her too, she's the oldest. She's not thinking about what she needs or what she wants.
Exactly. And that does make them, interesting foils for each other in a lot of ways because they are basically at polar opposite ends of the spectrum at the start of the story, where Saba is not thinking about her own needs nearly enough and is hard focused on Arban, and Amina is hard focused on herself and isn't really focused enough on the needs of the younger ones. And the thing for Saba as well, like, I don't know how far into the story you've gotten, but Saba Arban was in the classroom of Saba's younger brother.
Uh,
And notably, she's with Arban, not her younger brother.
yeah, which is not pleasant implications. Although even without knowing it, knowing that far into it, you can almost kind of feel the implication because with her really strong big sister mentality, as caring as she is of a younger kid, it's also easy to believe that if she thought she could be with her younger siblings right now and helping them, she would be.
Arban was who she could save, so she did. And now she's almost unintentionally, he has become almost a surrogate younger sibling.
In this moment, he is all she has.
I mean, she has her baby brother out there somewhere, maybe with her parents. I don't want to go too much into what happens with them. So it's a thing to consider that is obviously on her mind all the time, especially given what happened to I'm forgetting his name. Oh dear.
Fair. Uh, but she's a pretty smart, practical little lady, and I'm sure at the very least she knows she can't do anything about that one way or the other.
Yeah, obviously. But just as a result of who she is and what she's experienced, yeah, she's hard focused on Arben. And that makes Amina an interesting foil and pair for her because as Amina is learning from Saba and Arben to be more empathetic and open to the needs of others and is learning to be a caregiver, that is putting her in a position where she is now caring for Saba, which means Saba, over time, gets to relax a little out of the caretaker role and allow herself to be cared for, and in doing so, take care of her own emotional needs.
Yeah, it's a good balance they need for each other too, and the group needs that balance at the moment too because Amina, despite her selfishness, is trying to think of what's best for everyone. She's just doing a lot of internal whining and complaining as she does it, which is understandable. Whereas Saba is, you know, she's being as helpful as she possibly can, but she is laser focused on the one thing. And as we see with many selfless people, or even just sometimes people who work too hard, it's all too easy to forget that you can't take care of anybody if you can't take care of yourself. If you work yourself to death or get yourself to a point of being emotionally about to crack and shatter when you do fall apart, who's going to help the people you care about that you're giving so much of yourself for?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that whilst Amina is does eventually like start slipping more and more into the focus on taking care of everyone, and she is always there in the wider sense of just the immediate practical sense of safety, I guess, and things like that. She does start the story and and her early interactions with Saba and Arben focused on taking care of herself, even her getting them to an adult who's better equipped to take care of them. She justifies it to herself as they are better equipped to deal with that. As someone out there might be better equipped and therefore better able to take care of Sabranum. But the core motivation of that is that she wants to take care of herself and she doesn't feel like she can do that with them there. Meanwhile, Arben is, of course, focused mostly on himself because he's a child, a very young child who has even regressed a little bit because of the trauma. So, of course, he's not thinking about the needs of the older two. He is entirely focused on just getting home and being looked after, which unfortunately leaves this void where because Saba is only thinking about Arben, nobody is thinking about what this poor kid needs.
Nope. Nobody's thinking about poor Saba. She's not. Arben's not. Amina is the tiniest bit, but just the bare minimum of what she has to do to not feel like a horrible person.
Yeah, that's a lot for a kid that age to bear. And while surface level, she seems to be doing okay at first. It does become progressively more evident as the story goes on that she is struggling emotionally, and it's it's a good thing that Amina can grow as she does and eventually take some of that load off. And yeah, I really enjoy the dynamic they have. It's an important two-way dynamic, almost. I don't want to say dependency because of negative connotations, but narratively, it's a dependency of the two
Yeah.
characters that is really interesting to explore, and it's very different to the sort of similar to the like narrative dependency that Hector and Ellie had for each other, where their character arcs required each other basically.
Yeah, but they leaned into it as well. It was full on mutual symbiotic cooperation with the two of them.
Whereas, and that's actually why Marble is called Marble, right? Obviously, everything in the series is like the titles are related to games, which is has its own meanings and poetics and all that to it. But Domino is a reference to a chain of events
Yeah, Domino's an
where
easy one. That's literally like a merit what do you call it? A narrative trope.
Marble is called Marble because when you're playing marbles, the struggle is to get the marbles close to each other and not split them apart.
Because all they want to do is bump into each other and roll away.
Exactly. And the major struggle in Marble through a lot of it is in the dynamics of the group in this survival situation. So that's why it's called that. And
Marbles are pretty.
yeah, there's a lot there's a lot we could go into just on little things like that I put in places, but I don't want to get too into the weeds.
I choose to think Amina is the cat's eye.
But yeah, obviously there's a lot I could get into for Marble. I don't want to go too crazy with it because I want people to be able to enjoy the book without having everything spoiled. I will say it if you thought Domino was brutal, just like viscerally, boy, are you in for a shock when you get to chapter 2 of Marvel.
Oh boy. Can't wait.
I
Well,
mean,
wait, I got there.
you
It's
read it already.
chapter 2 is pretty early. But yeah, no, it's rough.
I mean, I don't want to get too crazy with it, but yeah, I wrote that chapter and was like, Jesus. I thought it was bad enough just including like just dealing with the symptoms of like radiation poisoning in general and getting into that, but no, there's a lot of study was done on the effects of like burns and radiation burns and things, and it gets nasty. So fair warning, I guess.
Yeah. That stuff is rough.
A little less attention to the radiation poisoning symptoms and parts, although that's it's still obviously a prominent part of the story because nukes. I guess something I do want to touch on because I know we're getting toward the end of our time, so I will very quickly talk about what is to come for the series, and then I'll sort of pass the ball to you. So I actually do have one more book planned for Pieces, which is the like series name, another game reference.
I like that.
Which I mean, this is subject to change. I've started planning and outlining. I have not started writing this particular book yet, so things could change. But I am currently planning to write a third book, Cold Pieces, and because I think the one thing that is missing from the perspective of all this is a look at Elton Kavar, the guy who leads the liberation movement and actually sets all this in motion.
Ah, yes, the man who was trying to destroy my voice by making me simulate screaming into a microphone.
That's the guy. So I'm actually my plan for book 3 is to focus on his family after the fact, post Kun.
That's going to be a very, very good angle to look at, especially because it sounds at least like it's likely to be our first one to actually have one or multiple adults as important characters and see how much more informed, assumedly, people are also dealing with all this.
Yeah, my current plan for that is that I'm going to actually jump between his perspective in the past and his daughters in the present.
I like that.
So yeah, you will get a more involved, informed adult view of it, but you will also still get the like younger protagonist and dealing with all that associated stuff. But it will be the first one that obviously is not taking part in Kuden as well. So there you go.
Yeah, Kuden's been through enough, I think. It could use a break.
It'll definitely it'll be a very different sort of book, I think, to the first two because it's not going to be dealing at all with the immediate dangers of the bomb, but instead
Yeah.
dealing entirely with the why Kavar became who he was, and in the aftermath, what that means for his family and him, how that affects them and all that. That's the plan anyway.
I just had a revelation. I was about to say I like what you're doing with the titles because it reminds me of when we were talking about inheritance, and I don't think we directly drew on it, but I kind of like that thing of having a theme for the titles, but also the title of the series not sneaking its way in until you're far enough in the story to actually understand it. Like how, you know, one of the books is Inheritance, and we don't even get there for a while, and at first
It's literally the
clearly
last one, yeah.
it's not clearly being called the Inheritance series earlier on either, and it's all too easy to just call it like, yeah, it's Aragon, it's the Aragon series. But like, I only just realized how much I actually like the narrative through line of the titles right now. I never noticed before that each individual title also fits the theme of inheritance and is an important part of the inheritance he is gaining throughout the
Yeah.
story. I mean, obviously, the first one is him. He's probably a part of
Well,
his inheritance.
you say that, but also his name
It's
is
true. His name is
taken
inherited.
from the first rider.
Yeah, first we get his name that's inherited. Then we get the magic, which is obviously the word Brissinger, which is obviously inherited through history and was the first word of magic taught to him by who we now know is his father, and is also eventually going to be the sword's name, which we all love to see. We got Brissinger is three. I'm out of order, but still eldest. Pretty obvious how that ties into inheritance, even without getting into the minutia of the details. Like an inheritance, I don't know why I never thought any deeper into that before.
Yeah, I mean, writers, we pay a lot. We work on our titles. Like a lot of authors, genuinely, the hardest thing for them is putting a name on their work. That
Yeah,
that is basically what I'm doing with Pieces as a sort of trilogy, and with the final book being Pieces, is obviously there is this narrative thing going on, this sort of like symbolic thing of the books being titles being related to games, because effectively that is what Ionia and especially Kavar are doing with people's lives. They are using them as pieces in this grand political struggle. And obviously, the last one can be taken in a couple like pieces. It's Domino is focusing on a series of events in a way, how it leads to all this. It's also a subtle nod to just the process of writing a story. But Marble, I've explained, and Pieces as a book title is not only what the thematic of the overall thing. It's also talking about the individual parts of a family unit. It's also talking about things being broken.
and they're all also pieces on the board in this
Yep,
political struggle. A lot of good layers to that one.
I try.
That's what I like in a title. No matter how cool something sounds, I don't think you can ever call something a good title if it just means one thing. Well, no, I shouldn't say if it just means one thing, but like a title can never just be a nice word or a nice name directly on the surface. The only thing I think that is ever acceptable about that is when the title is just like a character's name. But even then, I think shouldn't be done too often and has to be done right.
But yeah, so that's just a little bit of a sort of sprinkling of what I plan to come as far as this series of stories, how I'm planning to sort of close it out. But I do think I should pass the ball to you and sort of say, is there anything you wanted to talk about, anything you liked, just had thoughts on? Because I do that for all the stories, but I'm particularly interested for this one for obvious reasons.
And I've been really liking it so far. I like seeing the different perspective and angles we're getting, and also that this one is going a little bit more, being little bit more willing to shine a light on the human misery. Not that it's not a big, huge part of Domino, but it's another thing that goes in on the different perspective between the two characters. Hector is concerned with helping, which means although he's still being affected by everything he can see, he's also thinking about whether he can help people or not. And when he can't, he has to move on. Whereas Emina, despite trying harder to move forward without thinking about anything, I would expect is actually thinking more about the human tragedy of things than Hector is, just from a less empathetic angle, because she's considering herself a part of it. And I don't know, every bit of thing she runs into is, in a way, both something she's understanding as something she considers herself going through, but also a little bit of confirmation bias, and that she's so busy thinking about, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that, I need help, and this sucks really bad, which constantly leads to, oh wow, look, this sucks too. This sucks too. Look at how awful this all is.
Yeah,
Why am
pretty
I in this
much.
situation?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. They're both Hector and Amina are focused on the tragedy, but Hector is primarily focused on what can I do about it. What can I do to look after Ellie, who is clearly sick, whereas Amina is focused on this is shit.
What a pile of bullshit.
Yeah, certainly early on anyway. And you will see because of course again Marvel takes place over a longer period of time and is just a longer book, and you that means you get to meet more characters. That means you get to see more of how other people are responding to it as well.
Yeah.
My favorite character in Marvel is actually a bit side character who appears in two chapters. Her name is Lydia, and she's a lovely old lady.
Oh, we love lovely old ladies.
And she's great. She's helping with the relief effort, basically.
Aw. Characters like that are always fun to write. And oh yeah, on the human misery thing, I also totally get when you're talking about it being rough there, because sometimes when you're writing stuff, I find it so easy to fall into the emotional side of that. Like, I'm not going to go into my whole thing since I'm not actually writing it right now anyways, but I still, I've said before, Rowan, who is the character I have thought about the most out of all the characters I've ever written, the one I've put the most thought into. And I still sometimes feel myself having to resist the urge to like stupidly tear up when I'm thinking about the most emotional things he's gone through, or that I was planning to put him through. And like it the human misery thing can hit hard sometimes, even when it's not coming from a concrete, realistic place. Like when I think about the idea of, I guess in a way it probably has some parallels to like certain real world conditions, but the feeling of coming from a world, a place, a people that nobody but you remembers, and that might as well have never existed at all, even though to you it's been your entire life.
I mean, isolation is a very human thing. It's even those of us who are introverts are still social creatures at heart. So I get it, and I mean that plays its part even in the very real struggles of the characters in Domino and Marble. Even even Amina, who is so focused inward on herself, her immediate reaction is still to try and connect with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always fun to see. I don't have any specific critiques yet. Of course, I'm not as much through the book as I wish I was, but I've been enjoying it so far.
I think we can probably leave that there for now. We've gone on for a bit. We're actually a little bit over time, especially when we factor in the story at the beginning. So if you guys are listening to this over on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever else you're listening to it, you can also find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com. You can also read various short stories and poetry I write there, blogs and articles I post there. You can buy my books there, including Marble. Domino there as well, of course, and you can also subscribe to Premium there, which means you can read the books in full for free. Well, not free, you have to pay the subscription, but you can read the books in full without buying the books, as well as follow along with my anthology series epilogue that way. And if you are curious to see more of what John is up to, he obviously will be collaborating with me on plenty of other stuff in the future as well, including more of the audio work for Domino, as well as doing his own streaming, which is released on Twitch and YouTube under Sephir, Sephear.
Yeah.
Goodbye, I guess.
Toodles.